Good morning. It's nice to see you this morning. My name is Melinda Pettingill. I'm currently the clinical director at the Rape Recovery Center. Um, I'm here today to talk with you a little bit about an introductory to trauma. I think probably it's important to say that early in my career as a licensed clinical social worker, I really was trained in more cognitive behavioral approaches, so kind of what we think impacts the way we behave. Um, I found over time that trying to change people's thoughts and changing their beliefs didn't always offer the results we were looking for. In fact, it usually doesn't, in my experience. When I began conceptualizing people and their experiences and their symptoms through the lens of trauma, I really started to see my clients and the work I was doing shift pretty drastically. So I say that now because my bias in talking about trauma is that I believe to the core that understanding trauma helps us understand ourselves. And it helps us conceptualize how we see the world, not only how we interact with each other, but how we learn to think the way we do. So in today's presentation, I'm going to invite you to not only think about how this impacts your clients or your patients or the people you're working with, but also what does this mean for you and the way you see yourself and maybe the lenses through which you've kind of conceptualized the world and the relationships that you interact with. Does that sound okay? All right. So if you find yourself really applying this stuff to you, that's what I'm hoping for. So don't be afraid to go there. All right. So in introducing trauma, an introductory course. I know trauma is kind of in this mental health and even healthcare world that we live in. Trauma is the great buzzword of our time, right? All the rage. Trauma's all the rage. I'm hopefully going to work with you today just on why trauma has so much hype behind it right now, but also how it's applicable to the work you do. In order for me to do that, it'd be great if I could just get a feel for what is the work you do. So maybe why are you here? Why are you here today? And then what are you hoping to take away from the presentation? So if we could start with you, that'd be great.
Yeah, great. Well, I'm here because I recently started doing administrative work at a rape crisis center. And I'm really hoping to better understand how trauma affects our clients, but also how it can affect me in my work.
Cool. Thank you. And what's your name?
I'm Morgan.
Great. Morgan, I'll hopefully reference that several times during the presentation.
Great.
Thank you.
My name's Sterling. I'm a social worker at a hospital, and I support clients when they come in for an exam following a sexual assault.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's important work, hard work.
Yes.
And what are you hoping to take away from the presentation today?
I'm hoping to learn how trauma impacts our patients and their ability to cope.
Okay, so let me make sure I understand. You're wanting to understand better how your client's trauma impacts them and also how it impacts their ability to cope with what they've experienced as they leave the hospital.
That's correct.
Cool. All right, great. I think we can touch on both of those today. And again, I'm also going to ask you to be really present with kind of what comes up for you in the process. Okay, cool. So I think it's interesting when we kind of look at this this idea of trauma. People tend to think of some very specific things when they think of trauma. I'm going to ask both of you just to name what's the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear the word trauma?
Instantly think of like crying.
Okay, so really big emotions.
Yep, big
Okay,
emotions.
thanks, Sterling.
I was thinking pain, yeah. So
Pain.
feelings.
All right, yeah. I like that. I think both of you are touching on the overwhelming nature of trauma. Trauma really floods the system. And I think up until now in Western psychology, we've really conceptualized trauma as being something that impacts the psyche, that impacts the brain. But what we actually know about trauma is that trauma really, really, really floods and impacts the body. And so in order for us to treat them effectively, to be able to help with coping skills, to, like you mentioned, Sterling, to be able to understand, why a client's standing at the front desk and they're shrieking or they're sobbing, and what your role in that is. We really want to understand what's happening for them, both at the mind, the psyche level, but also what's going on in their body. And the best way we do that is really by understanding our own. So as we talk about trauma today, I'm going to ask us to really focus on kind of that connection, mind-body connection. So to start with, the best place to start always is the brain. And this is going to be a little interactive, and you can laugh. And those of you that are listening on the webinar, I'm secretly watching you, so you better do this as well. I'm going to have you put your hand up in the air. Just put your hand up like you're raising your hand to ask a question. We're going to do a little bit of a hand brain here, because what I find with people is when they are trying to understand the way the brain operates in the face of trauma, if they have a visual that helps them with that, they can remember it a little bit better. My clients hate this at first. They always think that I'm being a little bit silly, but in the long run, I think it really helps them long term. So you got your hand up in the air, your hand is out, fingers spread. We're going to talk about the development of the brain. So you got your arm that reaches up to your wrist. And those of you that are listening on the webinar, I've never done this in the way that I have to describe what I'm doing, so be patient with me. So you've got the longest part of your arm. This is our spinal cord. So spinal cord is the first part of the brain that develops, and it kind of lands right here in the wrist. And this is the first part of the brain that developed evolutionarily. So what we call this is the reptilian brain. The reptilian brain has one goal only. Any guesses on what that is?
I'm going to say survival.
Survival! We have a winner. Exactly, yes. So the reptilian brain is focused on survival, which is really great, because if we think about reptiles in general, like, they actually do need to focus on survival, right? And I think that that's so important for human beings to connect with that idea that the very first part of your brain that ever developed was the reptilian brain, meaning you will try to survive no matter what is going on. You'll try to survive. So you're designed, with or without your permission, to survive. You don't have to tell yourself to want to survive, just like you don't tell your heart to beat. You're designed to survive. That's going to show up for us in a minute as we talk more about trauma work. Okay, the next part of your brain, your hand brain. So put your hand back up in the air if you put it down. I want you to flip your wrist over and take your little thumb or your amygdala, and I want you to fold it inside the middle of your brain, and then take the forefront of your fingers and fold them over. So now you actually have a brain here, right? Those of you that are looking at the picture in front of you, you've got your thumb tucked in as the amygdala or the limbic system, and then you pulled your neocortex over the front of your brain, okay? So back here to this midsection, from your wrist to the tops of your knuckles, this is the mammalian brain. This is what differentiates reptiles from mammals. Mammals are lucky. They have the reptilian brain and the mammalian brain. The mammalian brain has two goals. They're slightly different than survival. Anyone have any idea what those are? It's okay to say no if you don't. No. Okay, I've got some heads shaking no. Okay, the mammalian brain focuses on two things. The first one is the avoidance of pain. The second one is seeking pleasure. So right after survival, we're instinctually driven to avoid pain and seek pleasure, okay? I want you to think about the times in your life where you've done things that are about avoiding pain or seeking pleasure, and then you beat the crap out of yourself later. And give yourself a pass for a minute, okay? Because you're instinctually driven to do this. You're instinctually driven to avoid pain and seek pleasure. One of the ways that I see that is I have a 2-year-old. When we're at home and I'm on my A game, I'm being the best parent I can be, and he starts freaking out because he didn't get the thing he wanted, and he's yelling on the floor, and he's screaming and crying. When I get down next to him and I validate, you're really sad, you're really angry, I'm teaching him how to be with difficulty, right? Most of the time, though, not most of the time, I would say a lot of the time, when I'm not in a great place, when I'm not on my A game, my response to that is, you're okay, here's a cookie. That idea that I don't want him to be with pain because it's distressing me, right? My mammalian brain is activated. I want the pain to go away. So I give him pleasure to make it stop, right? Well, that's for another day and another time. We'll talk about how parents do that to their children. So, right? So it's instinctual. I want to avoid pain and I want to seek pleasure. That's instinctual. This little thumb, so back to your handbrain, the thumb in the middle, the amygdala, that's our fight, flight, freeze instinct. That helps us a lot with avoiding pain and seeking pleasure, right? So if you think about, you've all heard the example of deer. Deer will be running and they'll hear a noise that startles them and run away, right? Their amygdala kicks in before they've even had a conscious thought and tells them to get out. The same thing happens with the freeze instinct, right? They're running across the highway and they see a car in front of them. The mammalian brain takes over without their consent or permission. They freeze. They're staring at you like deer in the headlights and oftentimes get injured in that process. So what I'm trying to drive home in this is there are two portions of your brain that thinking is not a part of. Reptilian brain, drive to survive. Mammalian brain, drive to seek pleasure and avoid pain. Okay? Those three concepts are really important as we internalize and understand trauma. Okay, the very last part, our fingers. Fold them over again. Just fold them over the amygdala there. This is the neocortex, or the frontal lobe. That's what makes humans very different, I think. Not totally different, but different in a lot of ways than other animals. The neocortex is where we see a lot of rational thought take place, emotions happening there, and that's typically separated into two hemispheres. When you hear people talk about the left hemisphere of the brain and the right hemisphere of the brain, they're not actually talking about the whole brain, they're talking about that front part. The left hemisphere of the brain and the right hemisphere of the brain. The right hemisphere of the brain develops first, and you see this. I see this with my 2-year-old. When he experiences distress, he lets me know right away. He's perfectly comfortable staying there. You didn't do the thing I want, right? He experiences emotion. The right hemisphere of the brain is also where creativity lives. We're all dancers. We're all painters. We're all really, really, really good singers until later on in our lives when we're told we're not, right? So that exists in the right hemisphere of the brain. The left hemisphere of the brain, which most of us cling to, with that it holds grave importance. The left hemisphere of the brain is where we learn the L's: logic, linear thought, A plus B equals C, list making. I'm going to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And what's interesting is that left hemisphere of the brain is so important in helping us reason and learn. It also sometimes is a distraction when people experience emotion, really intense emotion, and they don't want to experience it. They abandon that right hemisphere of the brain and jump straight into that left hemisphere of the brain. Or they're like, I feel pain right now. I don't want to feel pain. How do I stop feeling pain? And we go straight to the lists. And then we're pulling in the mammalian part of the brain. I feel pain right now. I don't want to feel pain. I'm avoiding it, and I'm seeking pleasure. So then my boss just rolled his eyes at me. That really felt painful. I didn't want to stay with the pain. So I immediately started thinking about strategies for making it stop. Maybe I started making my grocery list, or thinking about how I'd like to quit my job, or thinking about grabbing a beer in 47 minutes. Whatever that is, we all as human beings, we learn plethoras of strategies for avoiding pain and seeking pleasure, because we really see this as integral to our need to survive, right? We have to survive. So avoidance of pain, seeking after pleasure is so core to who we are. I think what's so helpful in working with clients is as they recognize this, there is a very loud and clear message in it. It's not your fault that you don't want to experience pain. It's not your fault that you don't want to be powerless or feel powerless. It's not your fault that you feel so overwhelmed right now by what's happened to you. Now, that doesn't relinquish responsibility, right? We don't just have a mammalian brain and a reptilian brain. We also have the neocortex, which tells us we can learn strategies for being with what's happening, for staying with it. And for me, that's the core difference between trauma work and other work that I've done in my social work life. Trauma work says, instead of figuring out all the distractions to get away from what is, to get away from the pain, to get away from it, we're going to secure your belief in yourself to be with it, to stay with it. Okay, so moving on. Now I'm going to give you a little actual depiction of how that plays out in the real brain. So no more hand brain for the moment, but you can see the neocortex at the top of the brain where the rational or thinking brain exists, the limbic brain where we've got that emotive part, but the mammalian brain, which is not depicted as well in this picture, the mammalian brain again is where we are focusing on avoidance of pain, seeking pleasure, and then the reptilian brain, which is where our focus is survival. One other thing I want to say about the reptilian brain that feels really important in this dialogue is if you think about a reptile. Have you all seen a reptile before? A gecko or a snake, something like that. Lizards are really good examples. Their eyes move really fast, right? And they can move their eyes to see a lot further out than humans can. What's interesting about that is that's driven by the reptilian brain. They're constantly scanning their environment for threats to their survival. So they're scanning their environment for threats to their survival. How that plays out with human beings is because we have evolved so much that no longer are we waking up in the morning and walking out into the jungle and facing the lions and tigers and bears. Now, because of the evolution of humanity, we wake up in the morning and we're scanning our environment for threats to our emotional safety or well-being. We're looking for evidence that we're not safe. Something that's interesting about the difference between looking for evidence that you're not physically safe versus looking for evidence that you're not emotionally safe is physically safe. You don't necessarily find it and you move on with your day, right? Emotional safety. If you're looking for threats to your emotional safety, you will always find it. If I have a belief that I'm not enough and I'm looking for evidence to reinforce that that's true, I will find it in any given situation. So that's the sad news. The good news is we actually know lots of strategies and techniques to flip that, to make that opposite as well. So for example, if what I'm looking for is evidence that I'm not enough, but what I prefer to believe about myself is that I am enough as I am, once I begin looking for that evidence, I find it too. I'm not an expert. I have a lifetime of looking for evidence that I'm not enough, right? I have to learn how to look for evidence that I am enough. It's kind of like showing up at this presentation. You speak English, right? If I were to be giving the presentation in French, maybe you'd get bits and pieces of it, but it would take you quite a while to learn French, right? So as we work with clients that have experienced trauma, we're also working with them on this idea that they can learn to speak French, or rather they can look for evidence that they are enough or that they are safe. But there's no Rosetta Stone for for this process. There's a lot of work in it, so we're doing a lot of work with it, right? Okay, so we're going to move on. I'm going to move into talking about using the body in this process. Okay, so I've got a picture up in front of you that represents the central nervous system. So something that's interesting about kind of Western psychology is for a long time we really separated the brain or cognitive processes thinking from the rest of the body. What we actually know is that the two are so intertwined that a physical sensation can jar us into thought, and a thought will build on another thought, and the thought will take us so far outside of our bodies that maybe we've left to grease. What I mean by that is, let's say I'm driving and somebody swerves in front of me. It scares me, so my whole body braces, right? For those of you that aren't watching, I'm clenching my fists and my teeth and my neck, and my whole body braces, right? And then I immediately have a thought of, and it's probably not conscious, it's not a conscious thought. I have a thought about the time when I was in an accident, when I was 7 years old and my mom rear-ended the car in front of us. And God, I remember that. That was scary. And then that takes me to another thought that's connected to another time that I was scared or I didn't feel safe. And so all of a sudden, our thoughts can take us so far outside of our body that now I'm over here in Greece, but I'm still driving my car, right? The truth of this experience is, in order for real healing to take place, we actually have to bring the two back together. The body and the brain have to be connected, or the psyche. They have to be working together. I think a great example of that is if you've ever, I mean, this is kind of a gross example, but if you've ever heard that rattlesnakes can have their head cut off and their bodies can continue moving for hours, for several hours, they can keep moving, which is super creepy. And yet, it tells us so much about the central nervous system. The central nervous system operates without our control. The central nervous, you think about something you're anxious about, and automatically that pit in your stomach is there, right? You didn't even have to go. You think about having to have dinner with your new partner's parents, and all of a sudden you're bracing, right? So the central nervous system is so impacted by thoughts, and thoughts are so impacted by the central nervous system. So in this process of understanding and treating trauma, or working effectively with trauma, because I didn't hear either of you identify that you're doing comprehensive trauma treatment with the people you're working with. But knowing a little bit more about how to navigate it is more than anything effective for you. So I want you to take a minute. I'm going to have everybody do this with me. If you're listening on the webinar, you're going to do this same activity with us. I want you to think about, in your job, the last time you encountered somebody that it was distressing for you. You didn't like it. So this could be a client, it could be a patient, it could be a doctor at the hospital, or it could be your new boss. Whoever that is, I want you to think about something that felt distressing to you. You didn't like it. So maybe someone was kind of shouting at the front desk. They weren't getting their needs met the way they wanted to. Or one of your patients in the hospital refused to work with a social worker. Had bad experiences with social workers and told you to get the bleep out. Something that created a little bit of distress for you. And I want you to notice right now what is coming up in your body as you think about that patient that yelled at you, or that client that was sobbing uncontrollably. What are you noticing? Just body sensation. What are you noticing?
So I'm kind of noticing like a little bit of anxiousness. I'm kind of like shaking a little bit, and it's like bringing back all those emotions again.
Yeah. Do you have any like actual body sensations where you're like tightness in my arms or my belly?
I can feel it right here in my chest.
Okay, great. Central nervous system is kicked in, right? Okay, great. Thank you, Sterling. Morgan.
Yeah, definitely the same kind of tight core, anxious feeling, and kind of like, for me, that feels like tingly a little.
Yeah.
I mean, like anxiousness, like thinking about. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, I think what both of you have identified, well, it's interesting because you both used kind of cognitive words to describe your physical process. So you used, I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling nervous. And that's what's so interesting about this work, is we leave our bodies. We leave our bodies. We're like, this thing is happening. It doesn't feel great to me. And so I abandon this physical sensation and jump right into I'm anxious or I'm nervous or whatever. It's just something to notice. That's all of us. All of us do it. So coming back to that physical experience, you, Morgan, you indicated something in your belly. Sterling, you indicated something kind of across this area, the chest or maybe arms. And what I think is important about that is the body is the key, because the body brings us right back to this moment. If I stay with what's happening in my belly, if I'm like, oh, there's some tightness, there's some movement, there's some circulation, it reconnects me to my central nervous system. Or rather, I just reattach the rattlesnake's head to its body. The two are now working together. Okay, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this today. I'm going to do a whole nother webinar on that concept, just because A, it's so fascinating. It's really, really, really fascinating. B, it's so grounding. When humans can pick it up, they can navigate their trauma and have confidence in their ability to navigate their trauma. So we're going to jump back to the body. We're going to jump right back into, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Polyvagal Theory. I would like to say, no offense to Stephen Porges, who is the, I guess, pseudo founder of it. I mean, he didn't discover the body, so there's that. But the human that's responsible for writing the most about the polyvagal theory in sort of Western psychology, he wrote a book describing polyvagal theory, I have read parts of it with a thesaurus in hand because it's difficult material to understand. I've got a depiction of the really the best way to understand polyvagal theory is right here in front of you. And again, I want you to think back to your work as an advocate, or your work as a social worker, or your work as an admin staff. As we talk about polyvagal theory, we're going to be focusing on you in it, okay? So polyvagal theory is the idea that there's a vagal nervous system that's kind of at the base of your spine, that really does sort of control or navigate the central nervous system for you. What that means is that when you experience distress, either the parasympathetic vagal system kicks in or the dorsal vagal system kicks in. So what that looks like over here, I'm going to use our little pointer, the arrow, is right here. Hyper arousal is, well, actually, let me back up a little bit. Let me back up. Sorry about that. I want you to go back to the distressing moment with a client, okay? Or maybe it's a boss, or maybe it's a coworker, whoever it is. Distressing moment. You got it? Okay.
Yeah.
Distressing moment. In your distressing moment, typically we have two responses to distress. Again, not necessarily within our control. Central nervous system kicks in. And we either jump straight up here to hyperarousal, or you're feeling overwhelmed, we're emotionally reactive, or anger, full of rage, desperation, fear. Hypervigilant, we're scanning our environment again. We're back to that reptilian brain. I'm scanning my environment. Is this client going to yell some more? Are they going to throw something? What's going to happen? We're really, really, really scanning the environment for what's going to happen. We're experiencing a lot of tension in the body, bracing ourselves for whatever's next. So that's a really common physiological response to distress. The flip side of that, how many of you experienced that? You did when your client was yelling that they didn't want a social worker.
It was actually when people contact me asking for help, no matter who it is, a coworker, it's like when they ask me for help and then neglect what the information I gave them, it kind of makes me angry. Like, you didn't listen to me.
Yeah.
And just anger. That's what I jumped to.
Kind of brace yourself. Your like tension. Great. Really, really, really good example. What about you, Morgan?
I think definitely the feeling overwhelmed stands out to me, because I think that's what happens to me. I get really just inside and overwhelmed and definitely tense, but like removed and maybe scared.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so typically hyperarousal is a really common reaction to distress in human beings. Another very common reaction, because of the dorsal vagal system, is the flip of that, the exact opposite. I start to numb out. I disconnect from what's going on around me. I shut down. I feel ashamed or passive. I want to hide. I maybe get tired. I'm like, I'm zoning out. I'm piecing out of this. So I get quiet and I go away. So the two images that I use in that is with hyperarousal, we get big and we're like mama bear, right? Like, I got to protect myself. And the opposite of that, the hypoarousal, is I get small, like animals that play dead, right? I watch bugs with my son in the morning time, and every time my son gets too close to the roly-polies, they don't roll up to protect themselves like hyperarousal. They lay down like they're not alive. They play dead. So again, we see this commonality between us and all other animals, is we protect ourselves or we shut down. Both are focused on that reptilian brain, right? The goal of survival. Okay, so we see this also, of course, in all trauma survivors, right? Getting bigger, louder, screaming, or shutting down. Shutting down. So when someone experiences trauma, they usually have those two reactions to it. Where we want to be, ideal place for healing. The body itself is designed to heal, right? If I had you guys scratch your arm right now, it would immediately begin to heal itself. It would immediately begin that process because the body is driven to heal itself. So is the brain. It's so beautiful. The brain is so malleable and it's driven to heal itself. But where that healing takes place is not in survival, right? Like, if you cut your arm and I start pushing on it and pushing the blood out and gushing it, that's not when the healing's taking place, right? It's when I leave it alone. It's when I, wrap it up so it's not touched, so it can slow down and heal. The same is true of the brain. So we're going to flip back over here. Optimal place for addressing trauma is right here. Feelings are tolerable in this window of tolerance, we're going to call it. They're not necessarily comfortable. So Sterling's sitting with my coworker, completely just disregarded everything I shared with them. That feels really hurtful to me and obnoxious, and I don't like it, and I can tolerate it. I can stay with it. Exercising empathy, like I'm not really sure I understand why my coworker's not paying attention to me. I don't necessarily know that that's about me. Maybe it's about them. We feel open and curious. We try to understand even in disagreement. We're right here. We're present. So people always ask me, okay, great, that's where I want to be all the time. How do I get there? Like, number one, you cannot be there all the time. You're physiologically not wired to be there all the time. That's just the truth of it. You're not. And it's a good thing, right? Because if you're facing lions and tigers and bears, we want you hyper-aroused, or we want you hypo-aroused. We don't want you trying to be curious about what's going on with the tiger, right? I think the difference, and I want to show you a picture of this, is that they really depict themselves in 3 specific ways. When I'm hyper-aroused, when everything inside of me is on fire, I'm like, act now. I've got to tell my coworker that is not acceptable. They are not okay the way they are. I have to do something about it. Or if I am feeling that intensity that Morgan's talking about in her belly, I've got to grab a glass of wine. I cannot manage this without the wine. So hyperarousal takes us straight to act now. Down here with hypo arousal, we become really kind of checked out. I remember this when I was younger. I was amazing at hypo arousal. When my dad would get mad at me, he would lecture me in this very specific corner of his office where he would say things to me, and I would immediately check out. I would think about other things. I had no idea what was going on. He caught on to this, and he's like, what did I just say? And I'm like, oh, geez, I don't know. I'm not even here. Sometimes I wouldn't even hear him say, what did I just say? Right? So both of those can work in our benefit. Both of them are really designed to help us. They also can hurt us in multiple ways. What's important about the window of tolerance is not that we're making bad things go away. We're not. We're increasing our tolerance for them. So, for example, through the senses, that's where we get there. When my clients say, well, how do I get there? I'm like, the good news is, to quote Rumi, so to speak, what you're seeking is seeking you. You're already designed to do it. If you can notice your thoughts of left and come back through the senses, what do I smell right now? What do I hear? What do I feel up against my fingers? Can you feel the grooves of your fingertips? Can you come back to sensation? The good news about hyperarousal is you've got so much sensation going on that you're just coming back to it. It's through awareness that we see the most shifting. So I'm going to move on. As I get a little sidetracked because, as you can tell, I'm pretty excited about this material. I like it a lot. I've seen it help a lot of my clients, but also works really well for me, my own life. When we think about brain functionality beyond that concept of survival, because it is more intricate than what we've discussed so far, we're talking a lot about sort of how does the brain function overall. So I'm going to use a computer metaphor. Not because I'm super tech savvy, but because this metaphor works for me, and I find that it works for a lot of my clients. The brain, after seeking to survive, does something in an ongoing process that never stops. It picks up on information and it stores it. It happens while you're sleeping, it happens while you're awake, it happens all the time. So the way that it does that is through the senses, right? I'm organizing information that I've picked up on through my senses. Oh, that smell, it's gasoline. There's gasoline, everyone. Oh, that sight. Someone just fell. I should run to them and help them. Oh, that feeling of water on my feet in my house. I think there's flooding, right? Information comes to us through the senses. So the brain itself stores information. In order for the brain to organize information, it must first be stored. In clinical work, we call this processing or making sense out of stimuli. So experiences, communication, etc., and then filing them where they need to go. So I'm going to ask you a question, Morgan. What did you have for breakfast this morning?
A green smoothie, actually.
A green smoothie. Okay, so you remember what you had for breakfast this morning. What did you have for breakfast on July 30th of 2012?
Oh, I don't know.
You don't know.
No. Maybe a smoothie.
Maybe a smoothie. It's a pretty safe bet. The reason that you don't know that is because that information wasn't critical to survival. You made sense of it. Your brain made sense of it and stored it in the file folder it goes in and put it away, right? It's not critical to your well-being to know that information. Now, if I were to ask you, what was maybe one of the most painful experiences of your life? I'm sure you'd remember that, right?
Yeah.
So, same thing. We have an experience. That we know the brain knows what to do with it. It knows what it's associated to, and it puts it away. It stores it where it goes. In basically, I said I'm going to use a computer metaphor, in file folders that are stored at different parts of our brain, right? So the other piece to this is that the brain decides where information needs to be stored based on its importance to the goal of survival. So it's stored in sensory memory, working memory, and long-term memory. We're not going to get into that today because it's not really important to what we're talking about. But what is important to what we're talking about is to remember that the brain is always engaged in this process of organizing information and data. It never, ever, ever stops. It doesn't stop. The place where it gets stored the most is during REM cycles of sleep. When, if you had your eyelids open, we could see your eyes moving back and forth because your brain is storing information, kind of like you shut down your computer at the end of the night and it put everything away. The brain's an organism that functions without our explicit command or permission, similar to the heart beating without us telling it to. You don't tell your brain to store information, right? But if we were to smell some very specific smells today, maybe the smell of fresh baking bread, you might think immediately of your grandmother. You might have memories that are associated to stimuli, to information that the brain has had to make sense of, right? So what does that have to do with trauma? What happens when the brain can't make sense of stimuli and it isn't able to store the information? Well, the place that this takes place more than anywhere else is in childhood. Anybody have any guesses as to why in childhood the brain can't make sense of stimuli or information it's exposed to and store it appropriately?
I'm going to say because you haven't had any experience, everything is going to be new.
Everything's new, and your brain's still developing, right? The truth of the neocortex or the frontal lobe is that it's not fully developed until around the age 26. I don't even know how old either one of you are, but maybe your frontal lobe is still developing, right? So we see this a lot, that most trauma, and I'll talk about this in a moment, is really related to experiences in childhood when we couldn't make sense of information that we were exposed to. We couldn't make sense of it, and we tried to store it with an underdeveloped brain. We tried to store it and make sense of things we weren't really equipped to do. The good news is that's all of us. There's none of us that didn't have that experience while our brains were developing, right? So what does happen with that information that we can't make sense of? I'm flipping to the word trauma here, okay? So when we think of trauma, the word trauma, you both experienced, I said, what's the first word that comes to you? You both experienced feeling really overwhelmed emotionally. Most people, when I say, what do you think of when you hear the word trauma, they talk about very frightening or distressing events. So they'll say what I call big T traumas. And not me, I didn't make this up. This is a pretty common way of describing trauma. But they talk about big T traumas. Big T traumas are things like war, domestic violence or family violence, a life-threatening illness, so like childhood cancer or something like that, a serious injury like a dog attacked you, a sudden, unexpected, or violent death of someone close to you, a natural disaster, or what my area of expertise is rape or sexual assault. Most people, when they hear the word trauma or PTSD, that's exactly where they go, is those big T traumas. Make a big T with both of your arms for me right now so you never forget this. Big T trauma. I'm not kidding. When I started with the hand brain and now moving on to having you exercise these things with me, it's because I know how your brain stores information. So I'm tricking you into keeping this inside of you. So we think of big T trauma. What's interesting about big T trauma is that big T trauma is very impactful, right? It's not typically as long-lasting or as impactful as little t traumas. Little t traumas are everyday occurrences that challenge or invalidate one's understanding of themselves or their world. So if we go back to childhood here for a minute, a little t trauma, I had an experience that fundamentally changed my understanding of myself or the world around me. And now, because we know how the reptilian brain looks, how the reptilian brain works, I had to make sense of this thing that happened to me. I didn't know how to store it. So it started acting the way I describe computer viruses act. I have been told many times this is not how computer viruses act, but just work with me for a minute, okay? So so a trauma occurs, whether it's a big T trauma or a little t trauma, and we're thinking of it similarly to a virus, where I can be typing up my email and the virus pops up right in front of me and blocks me from being able to see my email. There's a box saying this thing happened, and it's popping up at inopportune times when I'm not necessarily ready for it to pop up, and I don't necessarily know that it's going to pop up. And I certainly don't necessarily know what to do with it. For me, my response to computer viruses is I'm just going to turn my computer off. Like, I'm not dealing with this today. Now, you laughed at that, but I actually think that's how many of us respond to our trauma. When our trauma pops up at inopportune times, we shut down. We shut it down, dorsal vagal system, or we become much bigger, right? We're hyper aroused and we got to stop this now. We got to stop things from happening. So as we're working with these ideas, we're working with the truth of the matter is little t traumas fundamentally shift the way we perceive ourselves or the world around us. I'm going to give you an example of that. I've got a great friend that I went to graduate school with, and he is a brilliant psychologist, works with children, has done amazing work, has received lots of recognition for his work, several awards. And in our friendship, we've worked with each other on psychological concepts. And something that regularly comes up for him is he'll work with a child in a residential program, work with them on their trauma, their symptoms, their experience. And as they get better and they get ready to go back to their families, he consistently has this physiological experience of abandonment. Where like up here in his mind, he knows this is what's supposed to happen. This 8-year-old got better and is ready to go home, and he feels like, I'm being abandoned again. And this has come up enough times that he called me one night and he was like, we got to do this. You got to help me figure out what's happening here. Help me figure out what's happening here. So he came over to my house and we're talking, and I said, tell me the last time you felt this way. What did you notice in your body? Oh, it's just like right here across my chest, and my belly's doing somersaults, and I'm bracing myself for abandonment, to be abandoned. And I'm like, okay, give me another example of another time you felt that way. Same thing, last time a kid graduated from the program. Another time. Kid before that graduated from the program. Another time. Oh, I had a friend in high school that told me they didn't want to be my friend anymore. Okay, another time. He traces this back as we're working, and it doesn't work this fast for everyone, but he is a therapist. He traces this back to a memory he has. Being in his home, being in his grandparents' house. His parents had dropped him off, and he remembers waking up for a nap, and he has 6 siblings. And he starts looking for them. He's walking from room to room, and he opens each door. He's just 2.5 years old. He opens each door, and no one's there. His 7 siblings are gone, and his parents aren't there. And he can't make sense of this, right? Underdeveloped brain, he can't make sense of this. Where are these 7 humans that I live with all the time? And they don't come back for several days. He later, as he got older, found out that his oldest sibling graduated from high school, and they went on a trip to Disney World, and they left him because they thought it would be too hot, and they left him with his grandparents. Did his parents do anything significantly wrong? No, right? They were being very kind. They wanted him to be in a safe place where he wouldn't get tired and he wouldn't be hot. Was he unable to make sense of an experience? And he did the best job he could making sense of it, which is he decided it meant people didn't want him around. They wanted him to go away. And then every time in his life where that comes up for him again, people are leaving. People are leaving me. He's triggered back to that underdeveloped belief he created about himself, right? That people want me to go away. So, of course, his parents didn't do anything wrong. Definitely not a big T trauma, but was that a little T trauma? He made sense of something the best way he could. People want me to go away. Does that make sense? That idea that little T trauma, and I always kind of joke with people, even big T traumas take us back to little T traumas, right? When I've worked with vets that will say things like, you know, my comrade was killed and I wasn't. I'm like, what's coming up for you in that? I'm not enough. I'm not okay the way I am. Did that begin when you were in Iraq? No. I've known that idea my whole life. I'm not enough. Great. Let's work with that. Let's work with that. No big deal. Your brain made sense of something your brain didn't have all the data it needed to make sense of, right? I kind of joke with people like, okay, when you were little, you made sense of this thing, you created a verdict about it. Now, we're going to take your verdict off the shelf. We're going to introduce new data, a new jury, a new judge, and we're going to see. We're going to see if we come up with the same verdict about it. Because as we expose the brain to more, the brain can actually sit with more. The brain's so malleable. Remember, it moves and it shifts and it wants to heal. So it does. So a couple things about trauma. Trauma in childhood, which I have yet to meet a human that doesn't have some kind of little T trauma in their childhood. It's just part of our human experience. Being traumatized in childhood means that you continue to organize, well, in childhood or beyond, means you continue to organize your life as if the trauma were still going on. So again, you're constantly scanning your environment for threats. You're looking for it everywhere, right? And what do we know? Whatever we're looking for, we find to some extent, right? Not always, but to some extent. So something that is common about trauma in general is that we can see in kind of comparing childhood trauma or developmental trauma to trauma across the board is that there is a theme of powerlessness. So if you go to my friend's story, he couldn't make sense of the fact that his siblings were no longer there. He also couldn't change it, couldn't make it different, right? So in working with trauma, we are focusing on empowerment. And not empowerment in the sense where we're like, you're the expert on everything in your life, like not that kind of empowerment. I mean, even though, you know, that is true, but we're focusing on the empowerment that provides options after options after options after options, right? So we're looking at different ways. You know, Morgan, you said early on, like when a client comes to the front desk and they're feeling really overwhelmed and really scared and they're really anxious and they're coming across as hyper aroused. Give me the thing I want right now, right? We're creating options in that. You know, I can see that this feels really overwhelming and I really want to support this process. Would it feel best to you if you and I step aside into this room and talk? Would you like to sit right here? Just every option you can create when someone's kind of in that triggered place, we're looking for options. Options that allow us to distance ourselves from that core trigger of powerlessness. This woman can hear me, she can see me, she's asked me, would I like a glass of water? Would I like to sit in here? Or would I like to sit in the group room? Would I like to go over here? Would I like to do this? Now, again, you know, when somebody is triggered, they can oftentimes be flooded in that as well. So options can feel overwhelming sometimes. But the idea behind it is we're working with them to identify that they are not in that initial incident of powerlessness. Do either of you have any thoughts or comments about that? Make sense? Okay. It's bigger than this, and I'm going to do some follow-up webinars. I think I'm going to do 2 or 3 more where we're going to talk more about that. So stay tuned. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the effects of trauma on the mind. So we talked about how kind of brain chemistry works and how we're working with the reptilian, mammalian, and neocortex of the brain. We're also going to talk about what happens in this experience of trauma where people have a hard time differentiating the past from the present because it's very difficult to experience the present moment, to be present. When we're experiencing those body sensations of tightness and tension in that pit in the stomach, we want to go away, right? We want it to stop. Why do you think human beings are like, do you want a cookie? When the child's crying, we're like, here, take a cookie. Stop this. Stop. Right? And part of what we're focusing on is we're actually being present in it, which is really, really, really hard for trauma survivors because they are brilliant. They've learned how to leave the difficulty, how to leave it. Leave it through thought, through planning. I'm going to plan my way out of this distress right now. I'm going to think about something entirely different. I'm going to, my body, I've heard trauma survivors talk about experiencing something and their spirit being on the other side of the room as they're watching their body experience this. They are brilliant. The human brain is brilliant. When we look at these things as coping strategies, as the brain doing exactly what it's meant to do, avoid pain, seek pleasure, survive, we no longer see people as deficient, as not doing things the way they should be. We see them as brilliant people that survived, that had really, really, really normal reactions to abnormal life experiences. Dissociation in that becomes a survival skill. So dissociation is the idea that I can choose to leave the present moment. We all do it all day, every day. I've never seen it in such like mass as with the invention of phones, like little computer phones, where it's like I watch, I watch people like walk in, sit down in our office, and be told that their therapist will be there in just 1 second, and they bust out their phone. And I think sometimes we will kind of create stories in that, which is like, it's so important that I check Facebook right now. I actually would argue very vehemently that it's not so important that you check Facebook right now, but that idea of just being with myself for that 2 minutes while my therapist gets some water and comes back is so overwhelming to me when I have had a lifetime of learning to leave through thought, learning to leave through conversation. A lot of my clients will talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and tell their story. And I can tell that they're dissociated in that. They're removed from their experience. They're not in their body. They've told their story so many times that they put it in autopilot and check out. So we're asking people to learn how to come back. That's really, really, really scary when the truth of trauma is that your brain did exactly what it was supposed to do. It learned in a brilliant way how to leave. And now you're asking me to come back? What? Right? And so I kind of will joke with my clients. I'm like, I know that you came to therapy to feel good. The truth is, you actually came to therapy to learn how to get good at feeling. And that means feeling all of it. Feeling the pain, feeling the fear, feeling the sadness. So a lot of times I tell a story in this. Can somebody tell me how much time I have left? Okay, super. Sorry, those of you that are listening and you want this to be over now. Don't dissociate, although we all do. So a story that I tell sometimes is a great story that I heard from a colleague, or rather a psychologist that does a lot of mindfulness training and trauma work. And she says that she was working with a client who'd been sexually abused as a child multiple times, and they'd been working together for probably about 1.5 years, and they were really getting good at noticing how frequently she left through thought. She kind of disappeared and wasn't present in the room anymore. And as the client got good at tracking herself, she said, I'm pretty much gone all the time. I leave all the time. And she felt really ashamed of this. She felt really sad about it. And she worked with this therapist for a while. The therapist was normalizing, you did exactly what you're designed to do. I hear you saying you can leave most of the time. And when you can't, you'll take a couple shots of vodka to make yourself go away. And the therapist was so brilliant in normalizing that experience. You did exactly what you're designed to do. And the client came back after working with this therapist for a little while. The client came back and said, I had a dream last night that felt really important for me to share with you. She said, I couldn't tell if it was a dream or if I was actually experiencing it. She said, when I was a little girl, my grandpa would sneak into my room at night. He lived with us, and he would abuse me in the night. And oftentimes after it happened, I would get up and I would go hide in the closet. And my parents would find me in the closet in the morning. And they just thought I liked to sleep in the closet. She said the other night I had a dream. And she said I was back in the closet. She said I was laying on the ground and I had a blanket and I saw a light pop up. And it was the light, and I could tell it was the light from a wand. So I took the blanket off my head and there was a fairy there. The fairy was there and she said, Anna, this really, really, really painful thing that's happened to you, you are not ready to be with it. You're not ready to stay with how painful this is. Someday you will be. Someday you'll be ready to feel it, and you'll be ready to take care of it with love and kindness, and you'll be ready. But for now, I'm going to wave my wand and I'm going to take it from you. And you won't remember for a long time. And when you're ready, it'll come back and you'll be ready to remember. But for right now, my gift to you is you'll be able to leave. She waved the wand and the fairy went away. So the client tells this story to her therapist and she says, I think this thing I learned, this trick of leaving, was about me surviving. And I couldn't agree with her more, right? The brain is brilliant. It does exactly what it's wired to do. It takes care of the organism. Whatever has to happen for the survival of the organism to avoid pain, to seek after pleasure, it does it. I think what's complex in this is we then turn on ourselves for those survival skills, right? Like we turn on ourselves. What's wrong with me? Why do I do this thing? Why am I not okay? And it's in learning to shift our relationship with those things that we heal. As we slow down and start to connect with it instead of abandoning it or leaving it. That's where we see it heal. So sometimes trauma survivors look for stressful situations. It's become comfortable or predictable, meaning they don't necessarily like it, but they gravitate towards it because they know how to navigate chaos and distress. They were introduced to it early on. They know how to navigate chaos and distress. I think you can see that sometimes with the friend that's always in crisis or the coworker that's always in crisis. When you ask them how you are, you're like, oh, shoot, I didn't mean to ask you how you are because I know this is going to be like a really big deal, right? And what we know about that is that the brain learns how to navigate trauma. It can absolutely be shifted. Can absolutely be shifted. It requires that we slow down the brain so we're not leaving all the time through thought. We just slow down the brain. That brings us to the effects on the body because as we slow down the brain, it automatically slows down what's happening in the body. I don't know if any of you practice meditation at all, and I would like to be the first to say that I have been a licensed clinical social worker for almost 13 years now, and for a good solid 10 years, my mentors and people in my life were like, you need meditation. You need meditation. To really do this work, you got to embrace meditation. I'm like, that's not for me. Being quiet, being still, that's not for me. And when I embraced meditation, now I am one of the preachers. It changed everything for me. Not because it made everything go away, it slowed my mind down enough so that I could learn to watch my thoughts in it. Again, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more as we talk about treating trauma in that. But for right now, we're going to talk about how being exposed to trauma affects the body. So the body itself, again, brilliant, 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 brilliant. The body itself experiences things that it cannot make sense of, or trauma. Can't put it away, can't store it. The body experiences this, and it automatically, because of the evolution of the reptilian mammalian brains, it automatically releases stored chemicals or stored hormones into the body that are necessary for survival, right? So the brain and the body are working together towards survival. So when I experience trauma, when my dog is hit by a car in front of me, my opioids increase. So you've all heard the story of the man, the farmer who gets his arm cut off by his tractor and he carries his arm 6 miles to the hospital walking. Why can we do that? Why can human beings experience enormous amounts of pain and survive it? and then talk about it as though they really it was very numb for them, because their brains are brilliant. They release opioids, which are very similar to opiates, and can see that I have a typo on there, a misspelling. Releases opioids that go straight to the injury and numb the injury. It's why women can have babies and then decide to have babies again, because it can numb the pain, right? What we also see happen is catecholamines increase. This impairs rational thought. So catecholamines increase, which catecholamines are the hormone that release into the body and make us feel like we have uber strength, like we just grew into the Hulk. So, you've probably heard of the woman a car fell on the baby and the woman picked the car up. Like abnormal experiences of strength. The body is flooded with catecholamines. It increases strength very, very, very temporarily. It increases the idea that I can go, because, the British are coming and Paul Revere can run 26 miles. That's not because without training, that's not because Paul Revere is a great runner. It's because catecholamines have circulated through his body and now he can run out and do more.
Is this what adrenaline is?
Yeah. It's basically the same thing as adrenaline. Adrenaline's slightly different in that it combines other things in it, so that's why I didn't call it adrenaline. But yes, that's the name of the hormone. So corticosteroids slow everything down. So when I watch those roly-poly bugs in the morning and my son gets too close and they play dead, corticosteroids are helping that experience. When we're talking about the dorsal vagal system shutting everything down, corticosteroids are kind of like taking a benzo. Slows everything down, and I can go to sleep or I can pretend like I'm asleep. So something that happens in trauma, when we experience trauma, is typically there's a flooding of all three. And what this results in is just a flooding of the body. And oftentimes we'll see this if you followed Rebecca Campbell's work out of Detroit, the research that she's done on sexual assault and trauma is that if you can draw the blood of a sexual assault survivor quick enough after they've been sexually assaulted, which is very difficult because most survivors don't go straight to the hospital, we actually can detect really high levels of all three hormones in the bloodstream. And oftentimes what this results in is what's called, it's like a temporary paralysis. So it floods the body and we just go into kind of comatose mode or laying down. So this is why you'll hear lots of survivors of sexual assault saying, I wanted to scream and I couldn't. I wanted to fight back, I couldn't. I just laid there. What's wrong with me? And this is where we see the biology of our bodies, the brilliant, brilliant, brilliant biology of our bodies, to some extent betrays us in order to keep us alive, right? So reptilian brain is definitely taking on its role. It's keeping us alive at any cost, right? I'm staying alive at any cost. And yet, when there's conscious thought going on of like, I should scream right now. This isn't okay with me. I don't know what to do. I'm not sure what to do. And everything feels flooded. I'm moving slowly. I can't think the way I regularly do. This becomes really complex for survivors because afterwards they're like, no, I knew I should have screamed and I didn't. What's wrong with me? That self-blame kicks in. Right? And I didn't talk about this earlier, but in the face of trauma, when we're experiencing trauma, especially for children, when they experience something that's traumatic, they try to make sense of it, right? They make sense of it by assigning blame. And so when children assign blame for something bad that's happened to them, they can either blame the grown-up who did it, grandpa who molested me, or they can blame themselves. If we're thinking of trauma as the core of it being powerlessness, which of those choices has power? Which one makes me powerful? To blame grandpa or to blame me?
Much more like powerlessness in being someone else.
Absolutely. If it's grandpa's fault,
Yeah.
I'm SOL. I'll never grow up. I'll never be able to protect myself. If it's my fault, if I can change, if I can get stronger, if I can, fight back, if I can run away, if I can be better, if I can be a better little girl, if I can be nicer, if I can obey my parents better, I have some control in that, right? So when children tell, grown-ups that I'm working with that tell me they were abused as children and that they know it was their fault, I'll say, yeah, it makes sense to me that your brain organized it that way. And it was the safest choice for you because you still had hope that you could survive it, you could make sense of it, and you could get out of it, right? So it was a good choice for survival. Now we're going to relook at it. Was it true? Those things aren't the same. Whether it was a good choice for survival versus whether it was true, they're not the same thing, right? So working with and understanding the body, as well as incorporating that into the way we're interacting with clients. So that brings me to the last part of our presentation today. We'll maybe do some questions at the end. And again, I said I'm going to do a couple more that build on these topics, but we're going to watch a video wherein a detective and an officer interview someone who's recently been assaulted. I want you to pay attention to how the first part goes. Then they get some trauma training, and they go back in and they interview her again. The trauma training is going to repeat a lot of what you and I just talked about, but I want you to see, this illustrates so beautifully the difference between approaching it as an advocate, as an administrative person, as a social worker, incorporating that trauma knowledge into what we're working with versus not incorporating it in. All right, so we're going to shift to the video.
We need to take a statement so we can establish what happened on Saturday night.
What time did you get back to David's flat?
What time? I don't know.
Can you give us an estimate?
I don't remember.
Would your pals remember what time you left the club?
He seemed nice.
She didn't remember much, did she?
I know. And now we've got to waste more time on a daft lecture. We know how to deal with victims. We've had years of experience.
Well, some of us have had more years than others.
I'm in my prime, I'll have you know.
That'll be right.
Today's session is about trauma. The latest in brain science will help you in your work. I'll start with a tour of the parts of the human brain. The reptilian brain maintains basic bodily functions. The limbic system is also instinctive. It deals with fear and pleasure. For example, you pat a dog, it senses pleasure, and without thinking, wags its tail. The neocortex is the site of logic, imagination, planning, and control. It's more sophisticated, but because it's conscious, it's slower than the older parts of the brain. The amygdala is a key part of the limbic system. It has one job: to sense danger and set off the alarm. When it's a matter of survival, the primitive parts of the brain override the conscious part. There are 3 possible survival responses: fight, flight, or the one that people don't think of, freeze. When the alarm goes off, blood and oxygen are diverted to muscles, adrenaline floods the body, and all systems that are not crucial to survival are switched off. Normally, the job of the hippocampus is to file memories so you can retrieve them later, but in times of danger, it stops filing memories, which makes it harder to gather evidence later on. Instead, the hippocampus switches to pumping cortisol. What's useful about cortisol is it stops us feeling pain, so we can focus on survival. Can anyone give me an example?
A farming accident where a man carried his own arm for a mile without feeling any pain?
Yes, excellent example. It is an evolutionary safety mechanism which is fast and instinctive. In essence, it's our body's very clever way of protecting us. To recap, an example of the 3 parts of the brain working together. You're standing at a bar. Your reptilian brain is keeping your heart beating. You're enjoying the pleasure of a nice pint with your limbic system. You're using your neocortex to work out if there's time for another before the last train. What could happen to make the amygdala kick in? What if this happened? The way you'd respond would depend not on your logical brain, but on your instinctive brain. Being glassed in a bar would be a traumatic experience. Who can give me another example of an event that can cause trauma?
War?
Rape?
A car crash?
Good, yes. Trauma occurs when a person is overwhelmed by something beyond their control. The survival brain takes over the rational brain. It can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, with symptoms that last at least a month. Vicarious or secondary trauma is something you may experience if you deal with incidents such as rape or sudden death, or think of Lockerbie, Dunblane. You're not superheroes. Having a brain makes you all vulnerable to secondary trauma. It's important to understand that when trauma occurs again and again, it can become complex PTSD, such as in domestic abuse or child sexual abuse. The alarm system in the brain becomes jammed. Memories are stuck in the limbic system, so a trigger can set off the alarm. The trigger could be anything: a colour, a smell, a sound, a sensation. Now, the indicators of trauma. What should you be looking out for?
Depression? Crying a lot?
Yes, that's one response. And at the other end of the spectrum, total numbness.
Nightmares? Flashbacks?
Stress?
Good, yes. And they may feel sick. Also, shame, feelings of guilt, inability to enjoy sex, social isolation, triggers. People often feel overwhelmed by the symptoms of trauma. This can lead to using alcohol or other drugs to block out memories, or self-harm, or dissociation when a person's mind detaches from reality. Indicators can be specific to the type of trauma. Say, dental problems, when someone who was orally abused avoids going to the dentist. A victim of abuse might bond strongly to her abuser. This is known as traumatic bonding, or Stockholm syndrome. And jumbled up memory, when a person's normal recording of memories doesn't work. Can you recall any times you've seen that symptom?
What time? I don't know.
A traumatised person may not seem like her usual self, or may be hypervigilant, on edge, or being startled by everyday things. Everyone is different. You never know what impact trauma will have. Symptoms can change from day to day. So what does all this mean in practice, in your job? A traumatised person's brain is protecting them, but that normal human response of self-protection can get in the way of evidence gathering. The US military has developed new trauma-informed interviewing techniques that you can use to work around this. Research shows that if someone seems vacant, they could be distracted by their traumatic memories. Try to ground them by asking a simple, non-patronising question such as, "Are you thirsty? Do you want a glass of water?" This can help bring them back to the here and now. Don't expect a logical, linear story. Ask, "What can you recall just now?" Find out what the victim physically felt or saw. Working this way, from the instinctive sensory parts towards the logical parts of the brain, you'll get more results. In conclusion, 4 things for you to take away. Trauma response is the brain in survival mode. Repeated abuse can make trauma symptoms worse. In response to trauma, people will behave in unexpected ways. Remember, trauma is a normal human response to abnormal events.
We know that you've gone through a really painful experience, but we need to take a statement to understand what happened on Saturday night.
Are you able to tell us anything that you remember about his flat? Anything at all?
A dog. Barking.
Are you able to remember any physical sensations or feelings that you had?
Cigarette smoke. can smell it now.
What was going through your mind?
I couldn't understand it. I just couldn't move, or even scream.
To freeze is a perfectly normal response. So you start with the memories, you don't start at the beginning. You have to engage with our feelings to get to the facts.
Makes sense. Check you, Professor, getting all sciencey on us.
Well, if it gets us usable evidence.
There's life in the old dog yet.
Oi.
So I'm wondering if anything came up for you in the video that felt kind of relevant to the discussion we've been having, or any questions you had.
I mean, yeah, it was definitely really relevant. I thought, like, the perfect consolidated example of kind of how that can interact. Especially interesting to see, like, that type of conversation flipped both ways.
Yeah.
And how much more effective and better experience too for that person.
Sure. I think my favorite part is that the way they approach it after they have the training or the information is they start being curious about her experience, not the details of what happened. Like, we're not engaging that linear part of the brain. We're trying to be curious about what she experienced in it. And that's what gets her grounded, is kind of those questions about, what did you smell? Like, what did you see? What did you hear while you were there? Instead of, prove to us that this thing happened. We're connecting with the experience, not the logistics or details. The information can be recalled. We can recall that information, but not until we're stabilized, not until we've moved away from hyperarousal or hypoarousal. And did anything else come up for either of you in it? All right. Well, I think what's, for me, what's the most helpful about having this conversation about trauma is it really does help us understand ourselves better, understand our own experience in the process. So understanding that I was trying to make sense of something that felt impossible for me to make sense of. Being able to connect with ourselves in that idea that my brain and my body did the best they could. They did exactly what they're designed to do. I think as we can start conceptualizing ourselves that way, we have a lot more ability and compassion to really understand those around us that way. Like, of course you're scared right now. Yeah, that makes sense to me. As opposed to, why are you scared? There's nothing threatening in this space, right? So really being able to understand trauma allows us to understand ourselves and understand, or be willing and curious in understanding, you know, the people at the hospital's experience, or the people that are coming to the front desk and asking for help. I think more than anything, like, really, really committing to trauma work and seeing things through the lens of trauma has helped me to stop seeing people as deficient or bad, and start seeing them as survivors in really complex ways, survivors of trauma. So, like I said, I am going to do a couple more webinars that build on some of this material, and hopefully get to talk with you about it a little bit more. Thanks.